Hello again. Last time we were together, we talked primarily about the French and Indian War, and as you know, it is not the French against the Indians, it's the French allied with the Indians. All right, and that war ended, of course, in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. For the first time in 50 years, Great Britain is at peace. But is it really peace? This war had been terribly expensive for Great Britain. The War Minister, William Pitt, had gone to great lengths to bring this war under control, and he had spent money rather lavishly. All right, so things have got to change right here. If we take a look at the map behind me, and I'm not going to look there right at this second anyway, we can see that Great Britain has doubled its size in the American colonies. In fact, the British Empire has doubled its size too. So there are much land, and we have not that many people there. Now, one of the things that was established here, and it was done so by the King, George III, that's English King George III, was to create the Proclamation Line of 1763. All right, let's see what I have here. And I wrote this down here for George III, Proclamation Line of 1763. And before I go back to my map, let me show you what George III actually looked like. If you're following in your textbook, I'm on page 109 in your textbook. But there's George III. George III. All right, he would be preceded by George I, George II. He'll be followed by George IV. His reign served from 1760 until 1820. And I'll tell you right now about George III. George III was a rather weak king. He had some psychological problems, some self-esteem problems. He became king at age 22 years of age. He was a mama's boy. His mother was always on him like, George, act like you're a king. George, act like you're a king. And he also had this inherited condition. We'll remove this inherited condition, which is called Porphyria. I don't care that you know that, but I wrote it over here in the corner here. And this is a hereditary disease which manifests itself about the age of 45 to 50 years of age. The body has its inability to metabolize porphyrin. Porphyrin is a product of hemoglobin. And what it does, it produces a wine-colored urine, kind of a bluish-colored urine, and it leads to pain and seizures and ultimately dementia. And when George III, during his last 10 years of his life, George III, which is basically senile. All right, let's go back to the Proclamation Line of 1763, and I'm going to let you zoom in on the map here the best you can with your sharp eyes, which are far sharper than my eyes anyway. And let me show you where the Proclamation Line of 1763 is. It's this line here. You can see it in your textbook too, but it's this line that runs down like here. All right, now we all realize that all of this territory belongs to Great Britain. Great Britain has claimed all of this, and this, of course, is a Spanish territory found here. But when we look at this, this is largely Indian country. This is Indian territory, even though Great Britain has laid claim to it. You have the vast majority of the population, Native Americans. And so what British Parliament, actually George III, recognized that if you have all of these Americans, all of these British Americans, to suddenly rush over into this area, we're going to have one huge Indian war to take place. Well, you know human nature on this. Do you think people are going to actually abide by the Proclamation Line of 1763? And, of course, the answer to that, quite frankly, is no, they will not. And so we'll find that Americans will encroach upon Indian territory. This brings about a war. This war, which is called Pontiac's War. Now, Pontiac was an Ottawa Indian chief. There's several cities that are named Pontiac, by the way. A car was named Pontiac. But anyway, it spawned this war. Let me share an article with you here. If you were in class, I would show this to you, and you would have an opportunity to come up before class and read this. And anyway, it's just showing you an artist rendering there, showing you a scene out of Pontiac's War. Now, at this time, Great Britain had 13 frontier forts. 13 frontier outposts. Now, the Indians and Native Americans, which was a confederation of many, many tribes, Ottawa, Seneca, Wyandots, Mingos, and so forth there. But of all the 13 forts that were British forts, 10 of those fell to the Indians. Only 3 forts remained in place here. These are the 3 forts here. If I can find them very quickly here. We had Fort Pitt, which is located here. We have Fort Detroit, which is present right here, and Fort Niagara. there. All right, now Fort Pitt, by the way, it's named for William Pitt. At first it was known as Fort Duquesne, later it was Fort Pitt. Today we recognize it as Pittsburgh. If you travel to Pittsburgh today, you can still see kind of a reconstructed fort of where Fort Pitt and Fort Duquesne actually was present there. But I want to tell you a story about this, and this is kind of a fun story, and it involves a commander, and this commander was at Fort Pitt. And an Indian leader by the name of Turtle's Heart approached the fort. And he was one of the Indian chiefs, the Indian leaders, Turtle's Heart. You don't need to laugh at that name either. And nonetheless, he approached the fort, I guess under white flag, and he asked to speak to the young captain that was commanding the fortress itself, the fort itself. And he told him, he said, look, we have 6 huge Indian tribes that are surrounding the fort. There's no way that you'll ever get away from here. And he said, but I being a nice person that I am, I'm going to make you the offer here that if you'll leave peacefully, we'll let you pass through. Just give up the fort. And the young captain thought about this for a second, and he told Turtle's Heart, he said, well, listen, I recognize what you're saying here, and I realize it's futile to stay, so I'll take you up on your offer here, but give us a couple of days to get things in order. And so the way the story goes, the captain said, listen, as a token of your generosity, allow me to present you with these blankets and these handkerchiefs, and he gave them to Turtle's Heart, who graciously received those. Unfortunately for Turtle's Heart, those blankets and the handkerchiefs came out of the smallpox sanitarium that was present there within the fort. Well, you know the rest of the story here. We had a smallpox epidemic to set forth within the Indians there, and of course Fort Pitt did not fall. And that's kind of a good story. I like that. All right, so let's go back to our documents camera here, and let's move on with some things here. All right, so we called that Pontiac War. Now, we should recognize that. Now, the war had been terribly expensive. And I'm not talking about Pontiac's War, I'm talking about the French and Indian War. So what the British did, they were trying to eliminate or try to resolve some of these war debts, and so they in place several taxes upon the colonists anyway. I wish you'd recognize this in 1765, one which was known as the Mutiny Act. My preference on it, I always call it the Quartering Act because that explains it a little bit better with this. But this would force these colonists to quarter British troops, often in the privacy of your own homes. And you had to provision these troops. So you can imagine it like this. The Alabama National Guard is drilling this weekend in Jasper, Alabama, and they need places to stay for their soldiers. And your home will be very nice. Your bed will be very nice, and you'll be required to give them food for that too. And so anyway, that was a very disagreeable act, the Mutiny Act. And then we had another act, which was called the Sugar Act. And the Sugar Act, which was levied against the colonists too. And this covered a wide variety of things other than sugar and coffee and wine and molasses. This is all in an effort to generate income for the crown. And the amazing thing about it is, who asked the colonists? Did anybody ask them for their input? And the answer to that, quite frankly, is no. All right, then the British enacted the Currency Act. And this would prohibit the colonies from generating their own currency. And this meant that you couldn't produce your own currency. You had to rely strictly upon the British crown, the British money itself, the British pounds. All right, and then there was another act in this act, which was referred to as a Stamp Act in 1765. Now, it did include stamps, but it also included an array of different substances, too. Anything that was printed, any printed document, the piece of paper that you're looking at right here would have a tax on it here. Newspapers, books, licenses, wheels, pamphlets, playing cards, dice, anything that was printed, you had to have this special tax affixed to it. Now, this tax appeared like this, and let's see if I can get it where the glare's off of it. But that's one of the original stamps, or it's photographed one of the original stamps, and this had to be affixed to each one of those documents there. Now, I will tell you, in all truthfulness, the tax was not very high. The tax was not high at all, but it was just the idea of the tax. We were being taxed with no representation. We had no say-so in any of this. All right, so nevertheless, we're going to find that in the Virginia House of Burgesses, a trumpet of sedition will ring out. And one of the principal leaders of this was Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry even indicated that George III, like other tyrants, might lose his head. Some of the loyal members to the British government of the House of Burgesses proclaimed treason, treason, and Patrick Henry proclaimed, if this be treason, make the most of it. All right, so anyway, that's a situation that we have right there, folks. And so it went through the colonies anyway, a demand for an organization to form here that would resist the Stamp Act. And this was referred to as the Stamp Act Congress. It took place in October of 1765. It was called forth by a man by the name of James Otis from Massachusetts. And amazingly, I didn't write it here, but amazingly, we had 9 colonies to send representatives to sit in at the Stamp Act Congress and protest and demand that the King and Parliament repeal the Stamp Act. All right. So anyway, if we stop and we take our attention back to the Albany plan that we had during our last lecture, where we found that not a single colony bought into the concept of forming a colonial federation, now we have 9 colonies that are agreeing to come together and convene to oppose the Stamp Act. All right. Now I want you to stop and take a look at this for just a second. We'll go back to me here, and let's analyze all of those acts that we had. The Quartering Act. Yeah, that's an annoying type act. But does it really affect everybody? Not really. The British troops are garrisoned in places such as Boston and in New York. So if you're just the average American in the average city in America, you're not affected with that whatsoever here. And the Sugar Act. And if we look at it, Sugar Act, wine, molasses, coffee, sugar, gosh, I don't think I use any of those products. I try to stay away from sugar the best I can. I don't drink coffee. I'm not a real fancier of wines. And I don't think I've ever had a bottle of molasses in my house, ever. And we look at that of the Currency Act. What's wrong with that? These are British citizens. They live in America, but they're British citizens. Shouldn't you be using British pounds? Shouldn't you be using the British crown? But it was a Stamp Act. And it was a Stamp Act that affected everybody. Everyone was affected with this. There was no way around it here. So that was the annoying one. But nevertheless here, and let's go back here to my documents camera here. And nevertheless here, we're going to eventually see the Declaratory Act, which will repeal the Stamp Act, and this was done so in 1776. And the Declaratory Act here, Stamp Act was repealed, and with that, the Parliament will reaffirm establishment of control over colonies in all things whatsoever. Now I want to go back up my list right here, and we'll find in some of these cities, and particularly in that of Boston, American patriots will form groups. They refer to themselves as Sons of Liberty. Often you hear them referred to as Liberty Boys, Liberty Boys. Samuel Adams happened to be one of these. Samuel Adams was a failed brewer, a failed newspaper publisher. He'd been a failure at almost anything and everything in life, except for one thing. He was one heck of a propagandizer. He could foment public rage against anyone. Let's see here. I just happen to have some things here on my desk here about Samuel Adams. Here we go. Samuel Adams here. Here's another Samuel Adams button right here. Whoa. I don't think that has to do anything with the Samuel Adams that I'm talking about here as far as the Sons of Liberty go. All right. So anyway, and many of these Sons of Liberty would actually harass the stamp collectors, the excise men. You can read about this in your textbook if you wish to do so. So let's continue on with this. Now, in charge of the colonies, or one of the main representatives and oversight of the colonies, was our old friend William Pitt. He had always been a friend of the colonists here. His royalty title was Lord Chatham. Lord Chatham, he was a member of the House of Lords, but unfortunately he was in poor health, he was suffering from gout, and he could not continue in the assumption of his responsibilities of the colonies. So he's going to be replaced by an individual, a person by the name of Charles Townshend. Now, I want you to recognize that name, Charles Townshend. No friend of the colonists by any means here. Some people referred to him as the Weathercock. Some people referred to him as Champagne Charlie here. He betrayed the trust of every person that he had ever encountered, every person that he had ever met here. He was a playboy type. And for Charles Townshend introduced a brand new set of taxes upon these colonists. And these taxes, which were called the Townshend duties. Here we go. Let's get it back up here. Let me try to There we go. I'll lessen the light a little bit so you can see it a little bit better. But a brand new set of taxes. These taxes, called the Townshend Duties or the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767, would include special taxes upon glass, lead, artist paints, and I'm talking about for artists, and these artists' colors, these artists' paints itself, and also tax paper and glass, and I underscored here twice, it also placed a tax on tea. A brand new set of taxes on these colonies here. All right, so anyway, let's continue on with this, folks. And in 1776, I don't know whether it's fortunate or not, but I think it's fortunate for the American colonies that Charles Townshend passed away. And he will be followed by a new person in charge of the colonies, and this person is Lord Frederick North. Lord Frederick North. We should all stand up, give a round of applause for Frederick North, because we owe our independence to Frederick North and English King George III. Well, for Frederick North, he repealed all of the Townshend duties, with the exception of one. And here it is here, the tea tax. The tea tax remained in place. Tea tax stayed in place with that. Well, for the British realized that Boston was one of the, let me get my camera back here, that Boston was one of the areas that was a hotbed of protest. And anyway, so the British sent in 4 regiments of redcoats. Now, a redcoat is what we call a British soldier. They wear the bright red uniforms. It has the white stripes across the breast and across the backs anyway. But 4 regiments of British soldiers were sent into Boston. And at first they camped in Boston Commons. I'll show you a map, close-up map of that at a later time anyway. And in fact, I can show it to you right now. If we take a look at Boston, let's see here. Hang on just here. And anyway, we use this map on several occasions here. We try to contrast it a little bit. Now, what you're looking at here, you're looking at Boston. Now, this is a current map of Boston, but it's showing you some of the principal locations present there. I always encourage you that if you're traveling and travel through Boston, take the time to walk the Freedom Trail, clearly marked in red right here. Walk it, don't drive it, don't take a bus tour, just walk it. It's about 3 miles. It has a lot of history associated with that. But where Boston Commons is located is right down here. All right. And as I told you at an earlier time, this is where, around which the city of Boston developed there. You had the Commons area where you had your pastures, and then the houses would develop around that. So anyway, I'm going to come back to that map in just a second here. And that was Lord Frederick North here. And anyway, the British soldiers arrived there, 4 regiments of British redcoats here in Boston itself. If you remember from the last time we were together, Boston has a population of about 15,000, so 4,000 soldiers and a population of 15,000. This means like every 4th person you're going to see is going to be a British soldier. And they were so unpopular, their presence there in Boston, is that the British actually moved those 4 regiments outside of Boston, about 3 miles, to a place which was called Castle William. Today, if you're sailing into Boston Harbor, this is right at the entrance to Boston Harbor. It's still present there today, and it's my understanding you can go inside of that. I took this photograph from a cruise ship, and I've not been inside of Castle William. But nonetheless, that's where they were present there. All right? And so for many of the British soldiers, they had a lot of idle time on their hands, and life as a soldier can be rather boring. If you work your 8 to 10 hour work shift, that's fine. But what do you do during your off hours? And you just go sit on the cot in Castle William. So what many of these soldiers were doing, they were going into Boston itself, and they were looking for jobs, just a second job, whatever you could find there. And so, nevertheless, I want to take you to an occasion here. And this is going to be in March of 1770 anyway. Now, at this time, March is cold in Boston. It's cold in Massachusetts here. And on this occasion, there were several soldiers, and you can always spot soldiers, even if they're dressed in civilian clothes. You can just tell from their demeanor. You can tell from their haircuts. You can just tell from their association with the other soldiers. You can always recognize soldiers. If you don't believe me, go to a military town, and you can identify these soldiers that are present there, such as Fort Bragg or Fort Rucker, someplace such as that anyway. So nonetheless here, and this will be on the second of March of 1770, there were some British soldiers in civilian clothes that were walking down by the Long Wharf. And I'll show you where the Long Wharf is in a little bit. And nonetheless, here they ran across a Liberty Boy, and the Liberty Boy saw them, and the Liberty Boy, as the soldiers were approaching in civilian clothes, he said, "Soldier, would you like to work? You need a job." And the soldier said, yes, sir, I'd like to have a job." And this man, Samuel Gray, the Liberty Boy, I told him, he said, "Well, here, take this shovel and climb down into the bottom of my outhouse and shovel out the contents." Well, it wasn't a true job, and a fight broke out. Soldiers were fighting with the Liberty Boys, and finally the fight broke up. Well, that was on a Friday. Well, Saturday, soldiers were off, I guess, or whatever, and anyway, there was no problem. Sunday was a Sabbath, no problem. But everybody knew that the following day, Monday, the 5th of March in 1770, there was going to be a problem with that. And sure enough, what we're going to find here, on a very cold day, we had outside of a customs station, there was a little guard shack. And inside that guard shack was a cold and lonely, freezing British soldier, trying to be very professional. And here came some of the Liberty Boys, and they began to taunt this young man. And he was frightened. He was frightened very much. And more of Liberty Boys gathered around this guy. And finally, the captain of the guard looked out of the guardhouse and saw the dilemma that was taking place. This is Captain Thomas Preston. And he called out a squad of men, and about 7 or 8 of these British soldiers lined up in front of these Liberty Boys. And the Liberty Boys were deliberately taunting these soldiers. Soldiers had their brown vest muskets, bayonets affixed to it, and the Liberty Boys were sitting there trying to taunt the soldiers and swipe the barrels away and swipe the bayonets away. And then we really don't know what happened here. All of a sudden, we start seeing snowballs to come in, and these snowballs started pelting the soldiers here. Now, I don't know how you make a snowball. The way we used to make it, we would take snowballs and we would take it and take gravel and rock and pack it all together. And then we would also make snowballs that you would, say, throw at your little sister. And these snowballs, which were loosely packed. I'll leave it to your own imagination what type of snowballs these Liberty Boys were hurling at these soldiers. But nevertheless, we're not really sure what happened here, but somehow a shot rang out. And when that one shot was fired, then the British soldiers unleashed a volley fire into these Liberty Boys and ended up killing 5 and wounding 6 of them. As you probably well know, what this is referred to is the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre. If you get an opportunity to go into Boston today, let's get my documents camera over here, and if you go into Boston today, you'll find right on the streets there, not very far from where Faneuil Hall is a marker there that has a number of stars that are present here. I guess that represents the 5 that lost their lives there. Anyway, and that's kind of interesting there. One individual that, this of course is Boston Massacre. Here's the name here, Thomas Preston, the captain of the British Guard. I'm not going to ask you that, but I will ask you this. One of the individuals that was present as one of the Liberty Boys was Crispus Attucks. Now, Crispus Attucks was a mixed race black man. His mother was Indian, his father was black. And the reason I'm pointing this out, Crispus Attucks was killed, he was shot twice in the chest here, is that Crispus Attucks was part of the Sons of Liberty. He was one of the Liberty Boys here. And so anyway, that's kind of interesting here. All right, let me go back to my map here also of Boston. And let me adjust the lighting on this. All right, and where this took place here, Boston Massacre site, is right up here. It's right next to the Visitor Center, Faneuil Hall here in Boston itself. All right, so that's kind of interesting here. All right, I'm going to remove my map, and shall we continue with this? All right, so the Boston Massacre. Now, I think, and I would ask you if we were in class right now, do you really think that this was a massacre, or was it provoked? And there's no question in my mind, this was provoked, and it was provoked by the Liberty Boys there. But in the hands of people, propagandizers like Samuel Adams, and Samuel Adams with his committee of correspondents were producing newspapers. These newspapers were going outside of Boston, and it was saying, newspapers were giving reports like, you should have been there. You should have seen this while the British soldiers opened up fire and killed these Liberty Boys in cold blood. So anyway, and that was that. Now, disaffection will continue in the following year, and this following year in 1772, which is actually 2 years after that, we'll have another event to take place. And it involves Narragansett Bay up at Providence, Rhode Island. And it involves a ship which was called the Hms Gas Bay. And here's what it looked like right here. And the Gas Bay was a predatory customs vessel. And what was happening was we had all of these ships owned by the American citizens, if you will, which were present up in Narragansett Bay and up in Providence. They were smuggling goods in. This was a clear violation of the Sugar Act. And so the Gas Bay, a predatory customs vessel, had been sent to Rhode Island to stop this smuggling of goods that were present there. But nonetheless, in 1772, and you're probably not aware of this story, the Liberty Boys that were present in Providence set put a plan in place and set a trap so that when the Gas Bay would sail into the harbor and they would lure it over a sandbar. And sure enough, as it passed over the sandbar, it was stuck. Well, it was no panic on the part of the British. They were just going to wait for high tide to return. And when the high tide came in, then it would float the Gas Bay. But it took a while before the high tides to come in, and under the cover of darkness, some Liberty Boys from Providence, Rhode Island, I think that's where they were from anyway, nobody knows, actually rowed out to where the Gas Bay was, boarded the Gas Bay, dispatched the crew, and when they did that, they set the ship on fire, and they burned it to the ground, or burned it to the water line here. For the King and Parliament, they demanded an investigation as to who these people were that set the fire, and as you might guess, nobody knew anything. So, mystery unsolved to this day. All right, now I want to go into something else. Let's go back to the documents camera here, and I want to move over to this area here. And one of Great Britain's strongest companies was that East India Company. But unfortunately, the East India Company was about to go bankrupt. And the reason for this, it had too much tea. It had so much tea that had been gathered from India or from China, and it couldn't get rid of this tea. And the company was about to fold with that. And so what happened here to save the company, Great Britain eased the payment of one of the taxes on tax to the East India Company. And this was unfair. This meant that American tea merchants had to pay two taxes. The way you had to do this, you had to pay a tax in Great Britain on tea, and then when tea arrived in the New World, you had to pay a tax on it a second time. And so what British Parliament did, they disallowed or removed the requirement for the East India Company to pay the tax in Great Britain. They would have to pay it in the American colonies, but it placed the American tea merchant at a disadvantage here. So nonetheless, the East India Company started bringing their tea over to our country, to the American colonies, and when they sailed into Charleston, the Liberty Boys met them, and they said, no, you can't sell the tea, you'll just have to take the tea, and you have to store it into a warehouse. And then the East India Company sent ships carrying tea and arrived up into Philadelphia. So they went to Philadelphia the next time, too. And here we had a group of Liberty Boys that met the tea merchants of the East India Company and met them out on the harbor itself. And I will share with you here, we'll go back to my documents here, and I'll share with you a conversation that perhaps took place between some Liberty Boys in Philadelphia. And here's the way it goes. What think you, Captain, of a halter around your neck? 10 gallons of liquid tar decanted on your pate with the feathers of a dozen wild geese laid over that to enliven your appearance. Only think seriously of this and fly to the place from which you came. Fly without hesitation, without the formality of a protest, and above all, let us advise you to fly without the wild geese feathers. Anybody have an idea what's going to happen right here and what is going to take place here? Let me get this down here. We're going to tar and feather someone, and that's what the Liberty Boys were going to do to the ship captains there. Here's how you do it. You first strip a person naked, then you heat the tar until it is thin, and you pour it upon naked flesh. You rub it over with a tar brush, after which you sprinkle decently upon the tar, while it is still warm, as many feathers as will stick to it. Then you hold a lighted candle to the feathers and you try to set it all on fire. That's how to properly tar and feather someone. If you were the ship captain, what would you do? If you were the ship captain, what would you do? And I think you would tell me you would set sail, lift anchor, set sail, and you would go. All right, so let's carry ourselves up to Boston. And we're going to make our way to the 16th of December, 1773. It's actually a little bit actually a little bit earlier than that, 16th of December, 1773. And crazily enough, we had 3 ships that sailed into Boston Harbor and went up to the Long Wharf. And let me show you where the Long Wharf is. We'll go right here to our map here of Boston itself. And where the Long Wharf is down here. Now today when you visit there, it's above water. And we've had dirt, soil has been brought in, and of course this is now on dry ground here. All right, here was Boston Commons over here. Here's where the Boston Massacre took place, and down here's where you'll find this event that I'm talking about here. And 3 ships came into that area, and they dropped anchor, and they prepared to unload their tea. And the Liberty Boys met them out on the shore there, out there on the wharf, and they told them, said, you're not going to unload the tea. And the ship captains said, well, we're under orders to unload the tea. And then the governor of Boston, the governor of Massachusetts, who was loyal to the crown, sent out a message to the ship captain and said, unload the tea. And the Liberty Boys were saying, you can't unload the tea. And so it was one of those dilemmas there. Well, after about 3 days of this, on the 16th of December, 1773, the situation resolved itself. For whatever crazy reason here, we had 150 Mohawk Indians, and I don't know why Mohawk Indians would have a dog in this fight, but the Mohawk Indians went down to the Long Wharf, boarded those 3 ships, and threw 342 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor. All right, why in the world would Mohawk Indians, 150 of those, do such an atrocious act such as that? Or maybe it was 150 Liberty Boys dressed as Mohawk Indians. You know as well as I, what do we call that event? That event is known as the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party. And you need to recognize that, Boston Tea Party. All right. The loss to the British in the East India Country was 11,000 pounds sterling. That equates to today to about $900,000. $900,000 in U.S. money. And of course, for the King, George III, and also for British Parliament, who do you think is going to pay for this? And the city of Boston is going to have to pay for this. All right, so they called it the coercive acts here. And anyway, the Bostonian citizens refused to pay this. So in turn, what the British did, they closed Boston. Closed it to sea traffic here, reduced the powers of town meetings itself. Royal officers accused of crimes were tried outside of Boston. And it also recirculated the Quartering Act or the Mutiny Act. For the people in Boston, they refer to this as the Intolerable Acts, That just cannot take place. All right here, so let's continue on for a few minutes here. And we'll find that, once again, we're going to have another convention to take place. This will take place in September 1774. This is referred to as the First Continental Congress. First Continental Congress, it will take place in Carpenter's Hall. And I failed to bring out a photograph of Carpenter's Hall. I'll do that the next time we get together. It does take place in Philadelphia here. And actually, 12 colonies were present. If we remember here with the Albany Plan, we had no colonies that bought into the Albany Congress, the Albany Plan. We had 9 that were supportive of the Stamp Act Congress. And now we're going to go into the First Continental Congress. And by holy moly, we have 12 colonies that buy into this. The only colony that was not present for the Continental Congress here was out of Georgia. And there are various reasons for this, too. All right, so what did they decide upon here? They rejected a proposal to form a colonial union under England. That was one of the first provisions that they adopted here. They also requested that England repeal all oppressive legislation since 1763. The third thing that they did, they all agreed that they would make military preparations. Now, make military preparations. Now, remember, we already have a king's army here, and now these Americans are going to prepare, and perhaps prepare to fight the British. The next thing that they agreed upon out of the 5 provisions, you can't read this very well. Let's see if I can change my lighting on this. They agreed to the non-importation, the non-exportation, and non-consumption of British goods. If it had a British label on it, if it was manufactured by Great Britain, if it was brought in by Great Britain, the American colonists were refusing to use that. And the second thing, and the last thing they did here, they all agreed they would meet the following spring. And will they meet the following spring? You betcha. They will meet the following spring. And one final thing I want to mention to you today here, my friends here, is that in many of these communities, they began to form citizens groups. These were militia citizens groups. These are some of the youngest, some of the strongest men, young boys here, around the age of 15 up to about the age of 25. And farmers by day, but during times of need, they would take up a musket, a brown bess musket, and they would go to the defense of the community. As you well know, it's right here in front of you. What do we call those individuals? They are referred to as Minutemen. They will organize themselves in a minute company of men who will be commanded by a captain, a minute captain here. All right, so we're going to stop for the time being here. And when we come back, my friends, we're going to go into the American Revolution, the beginning of the American Revolution. You're going to see the first shots of the American quest for independence to take place. I'm not going to tell you where right now, but that'll be during your next lecture. Your next lecture will be a rather short lecture, because after that lecture, you're going to have your first examination take place here. All right, stay with me, your material here, and thank you very much for your attendance.